This video is based on subsidies as a method of government intervention. So what is a subsidy? A subsidy is a financial contribution made by the government, and it's made by the government using public resources. So it's supposed to act as an incentive. So an incentive in the form of a financial aid. Now this isn't a loan, this is a payment which does not need to be repaid. So it's there to support extended to an economic sector, generally with the aim of promoting economic and social policy. And we'll look at some examples of subsidies and I suppose who they benefit and why later in this video. So 4 common examples of subsidies which you'd find in most Western countries. So to begin with, an export subsidy. Now within economics you'll probably look at this more in macroeconomics within international trade. But this is when the government provides financial support to companies for the purpose of exporting goods to sell internationally. So it's there to help encourage them to open up an export market or to become, I suppose, remain and become competitive globally. So the exporter will report the volume of exports to the government, who will in turn compensate them. Second one is an agricultural subsidy, which has been a hot topic for debate in recent times, especially regarding Brexit. So obviously the UK, they're not going to receive those subsidies from the Common Agricultural Policy anymore because of not being part of the EU. So there has been a topic of discussion as to what will replace them. Now, agricultural subsidies generally, they're used to protect domestic food prices. So for example, this is just one example, but by paying farmers to keep production down in order to make sure that supply kept pace with demand. So what that'll do is help to stabilise food prices, but that's just one example. And it also helps to ensure food production isn't wasted. A third one is a housing subsidy, which was quite common under David Cameron. And this is to help give citizens the opportunity to own homes by providing interest rate subsidies and down payment assistance. So one example is this matching funds for low-income families. And if you remember in the Help to Buy campaign, you could put down 5% deposits because the government would match it. Another one is the healthcare subsidy. Now, obviously, the NHS is funded through the national insurance contributions, and it is free at the point of use. But some of the services you still require to pay. So that could include prescriptions and dental treatment. Now, some demographics, for example, if you're looking at students, they do not have to pay anything, and that's because it is heavily subsidised. Now, what I'm going to do is just show you some more examples of subsidies that we have or have had in recent times.
Caps monthly health insurance premiums to a percentage of your monthly income, the federal government provides tax credits, subsidies, in order to help the individuals and families purchase qualified health insurance plans from marketplaces such as HealthCentric. Eligibility starts with basic residency and citizenship requirements. Next, your monthly income must be at or less than 4 times the federal poverty level, or 400% FPL. In some states, Medicaid availability has been expanded to cover incomes up to 133% FPL. So if you fall between 133% and 400% of FPL, you may be eligible for a health insurance subsidy.
The negotiations over the Brexit deal are far from over, but the Environment Secretary, Michael Gove, is setting out proposals for what farming in England might look like once we leave the EU. He wants to replace the current EU subsidy, which is based on how much land you own, with one based on what you do with the land. But his proposals wouldn't come into effect till 2024. That's well after another general election.
And whilst we're on the subject, speaking of Brexit, with so much of the European Union's money spent on farming subsidies, there has been, quite understandably, some uncertainty about how farmers are going to be affected. Well, today, the Environment Secretary, Michael Gove, tried to make clear they had nothing to fear. He set out how farmers will continue to receive payments for 5 years if they improve or enhance their land and the countryside generally. More than half of all EU funding is spent on farming subsidies. That's around £3 billion. Around 180,000 farmers benefit, each receiving around £17,000 a year.
So when considering the diagram for a subsidy, first of all we have to think about the situation. And let's imagine that we've got an industry or we've got a good which is perhaps being under-consumed and the government is not satisfied with Q1. and that volume of goods being produced. Possibly it's a merit good and they believe it has positive externalities, but it is undervalued and it is underconsumed. So they're trying to incentivize both the consumer to buy it and the producer to produce it. So let's say they wanted it at Q2. Now at Q2, in order to incentivize the consumer and the producer, you have to consider as to where it meets the demand curve and where it meets the supply curve. So for example, when we're looking at the demand curve, to encourage customers to buy at Q2, it means that P2 has to be offered to the consumer. And for the producer to produce at Q2, there is no way they are going to produce it at P2. It's far too low, especially considering that they were getting P1 at Q1. So they would have to have it at P3. So the government needs to try to encourage the consumer at P2 and the producer at P3. And that is the size of the subsidy per unit. So the consumer will be paying P2, but yet the producer will be receiving P3. And because of that, because the producer is receiving the higher price, that also helps them to cover their costs of production. And it means they're much more able and willing to produce. So what we have is an increase in supply of S1 going to S2. And the movement of the supply curve is simply because of the payment by the government to the producer, which helps to reduce their cost of production. Now, it's also worth pointing out that the cost to the government of this subsidy, because we're not looking at just per unit, we're looking at the entire cost of the subsidy, it would be that black shaded box, because it would go from 0 to Q2 and it would go from P2 to P3. So we have to consider the reasons why the government is willing to pay for subsidies. And one of the reasons could be because the company or the industry, the really big employers within that country. So let's imagine it was a sunset industry. So what I mean by that is it's potentially on the decline. Maybe it's struggling in terms of competitiveness, which I'll look at in the next point. But because it has so many workers working within that industry or for that company, the government, at least for the short term, believe it needs protecting, and therefore by providing those subsidies, it just keeps the industry or keeps the company afloat, keeps them surviving, and it means that they get to continue to pay and hire those workers. Now, with regards to why it might be a sunset industry, I mentioned competitiveness, and it could be to improve international competitiveness. So it could be, for example, again, a sunset industry where they're struggling to compete with overseas companies, and therefore a subsidy might help them to do so. It could be an infant industry where it just needs nurturing, it needs a bit of development, and the government might provide their subsidies to help accelerate that development. And it could be what I've mentioned before, that the good has positive externalities, yet is being underconsumed, and therefore it requires that that incentive by the government to do so. So when we're thinking about the diagram again, we can bring in consumer and producer surplus. So to begin with, this was the consumer surplus before the subsidy was offered. Now, obviously, because the government has provided that subsidy, it's allowed now for the price to go from P1 to P2. So what we see is that consumer surplus is increased and it goes to that point. So what we can see there is obviously the consumer surplus has grown because of the subsidy. Now, if we think about the producer, initially the producer surplus was at this point here up to P1. But again, now the producer is receiving P3, so therefore what we see is the producer surplus goes up and it increases, just like we said about the consumer surplus. So what we've got there is a much bigger producer surplus. But that still leaves this, okay? And this triangle highlights that actually there is still a deadweight loss attached to this. And that's because the government is having to fund it, and there is still a welfare loss of that triangle. So when we're looking at the issues related to a subsidy, there's some headlines that I've picked out from recent times. And if you look at from 150 million meals a year thrown away rather than given to the hungry because of 600 million government subsidies. So in other words, is it actually encouraging waste? One of the reasons for a subsidy was to discourage waste, but it could also have the opposite effect. $500 billion spent on fossil fuel subsidies, mostly complete waste of money. So there's some industries where you think, well, how are they still being subsidised considering the impact it has on the environment? but we still see fossil fuel industries being subsidised within the UK and other countries. Which, again, you might think, well, if we're subsidising green energy, if we're subsidising agriculture to try and encourage them to be greener, then why are we still offering fossil fuel subsidies? The 93 billion handshake, business pocket, huge subsidies and tax breaks. So again, how are these being awarded, these subsidies? And there has been accusations, especially of this most recent government, as to how businesses are possibly receiving subsidies. And is it more due to networking and friendship rather than actually deserving those subsidies? And do farmers make more from subsidies than agriculture? And that could suggest that actually they are solely, completely reliant on subsidies. And therefore, if you took those subsidies away, could these industries survive? And if not, is that just pretty much covering the cracks and covering the inefficiency within those industries? So again, some key problems of subsidies. The opportunity cost involved. So if the government chooses to offer subsidies to a certain financial sum, where could that money have been spent and to what effect? Is it wasteful? Does it incentivise businesses to cut costs? Could it actually cause inefficiency? So what I mean by that is, does it actually drive companies on? If they know that they're getting subsidies, does it mean that they become complacent? Does it mean that they do not need to be as innovative as they previously were? There is an argument that they use these subsidies for good and it actually can help to increase profit levels, which can then be retained. But then there's also this argument as well. And finally, it is expensive for the government, but there's still a deadweight loss attached. And again, I suppose that just links to the opportunity cost involved and what happens if this subsidy is suddenly stopped. Do we need to require to continue to pay that subsidy for the long term? Because if they didn't, the industry or the company would just simply fail.